For more, we're joined by Professor Markus Wagner from the University of Wollongong Australia. Professor Wagner, thank you for making the time to speak with us. Mr. Trudeau has just announced 25% retaliatory tariffs. How significant is this?
I think this is very significant. The announcement that Donald Trump made was already a threat for Canada, Mexico, and China. And experts have expected, and this is to be expected, that countries will retaliate in kind, and that's exactly what we're seeing. A stepped approach, just like the US has threatened to impose starting Tuesday, and then a couple of weeks later, exactly the equivalent amount of tariffs being imposed on US goods. And this is between neighbors that have been traditional neighbors. You've heard this in the words of Justin Trudeau, who first really tried to address himself at the US population and then tried to address himself at the US president.
Do you think China and Mexico could take similar measures to Canada?
Mexico has already announced that it does, and this again is to be expected. And the interesting thing is that in the U.S. Executive order, there's language in there that if one country starts to retaliate against the U.S., then there will be counter-retaliation, and we can expect counter-retaliation over counter-retaliation from all sides. China might be slightly different. The additional tariff is 10%, not as high, but already on top of existing tariffs. The question really is how the Chinese government wants to react. It has to be seen to be doing something. That's true for all governments in the world. And so we should expect to see some kind of retaliation there as well.
What kind of immediate impacts could these tit-for-tat tariffs have on consumers and global trade overall?
So the initial effects are slightly ameliorated because there's still some stock, if you will, in these supply chains that will be impacted starting Tuesday. But in the next few weeks, those supplies will run out. That means that whenever you have a good crossing a border from Canada to Mexico, or from Mexico to the US, or Canada to the US, you then have these 25% tariffs imposed. And just to be clear, if you think about cars and the supply chain in cars on the North American continent are very intertwined. Parts crisscross the borders numerous times before a final car gets to the sales lot. A $50,000 car with a 25% tariff is likely going to cost somewhere on the order of $10,000 to $12,500 more at some point in the not too distant future.
There are fears of a full-blown trade war. How concerned should we be?
I was thinking about this morning when the news started to percolate that this will actually happen and the Canadian government will retaliate. For the time being, we might think that this is cabined, if you will, to the North American continent on particular goods like potash and critical minerals on the North American continent. But if you then start to think that this will have wider ramifications for countries where I'm at in Australia, but also in Europe, what we're seeing, and this is a real threat in my mind, this weaponization of trade, if you will, is that Donald Trump is using tariff threats or actual tariffs against countries for things that are completely unrelated to trade. So in this particular instance, it's the supposed crossing of fentanyl and illegal immigrants, as Donald Trump calls them, from the Canadian border. There's very few. Same thing with Mexico. But what we're also seeing is threats against Denmark over Greenland. And so it's this weaponization of trade relations, which we really only have seen in the 1930s, that then led to the so-called beggar thy neighbor policy and ultimately contributed to the outbreak of World War II. I don't think we're there yet, but we're certainly not in a good place at this particular moment in time.
You mentioned the weaponization of trade tools. Mr. Trump insists these measures are not a negotiating tool. So what exactly is his end game? What does he want?
You'll forgive me if I'm slightly snide about this right now, but Donald Trump says many things. And so I would just take him not for his word at what he says at any particular moment, but what he does. And what he has done with the executive order is exactly weaponizing trade relations. Now, he might say this is about fentanyl, but the level of fentanyl coming over from the Canadian side is relatively minor. And you see this sort of spat of words increasing and escalating. So I think Donald Trump's worldview, if you will, is much more, I'm trying to bend other countries to my will. And I think this is something that should be concerning not only to this particular dispute between Canada and the US and Mexico and China, but much more broadly. Because if you think about it, Canada and the US have had traditionally really good relations. If the US is willing to impose these type of measures on one of its closest allies, what would it do to countries that are not nearly as closely aligned?
So, Professor, then what are the chances any of these three countries will succumb to US pressure?
That is, well, in the case of Canada and Mexico, that's much more likely than is the case with respect to China, I would submit. And the succumbing, if you will, might be in the offing. I think there might be some wins because that what appears what Donald Trump thrives on. But this is a short-term game versus a long-term loss idea. My impression was that if you recall, just a week ago, we talked about the Colombian president not allowing planes, military planes carrying migrants back into Colombia to land. Trump used tariffs, but I think the mood in Latin America is very rapidly changing against the US on that front. And if you leave a vacuum, it'll be filled by someone else, and that power, to my mind, is China at this point.
Professor, Mr. Trump says there are more tariffs to come. How is his tariff war different this time round compared to his first term in office?
It's much more planned. We had heard these announcements prior to the election. We then initially thought this would happen on January 20th, according to his announcements. Then it was February 1st, which turned out to be the case. And if you look at the announcement, it's more planned out. These counter retaliation, for example, is one way to think about this. And Donald Trump and his allies are clearly trying to play a slightly longer game, but I'd still think that in the end, no one loses. And tariffs are rightly oftentimes called a circular firing squad. So I think that's one thing to bear in mind. U.S. consumers will pay more for goods coming from Canada, Mexico, as well as China at this point. The countries' supply chains are incredibly closely intertwined. We might even see, if you think about this, the Mexican government hardly has any reserves left, if you will. There might be even increases in migration from Mexico into the U.S. because of what a colleague of mine in Mexico has described as an impending recession there. So it's all sort of short-term gain to one's own constituency, but a long-term or midterm loss for the U.S. itself.
Thank you, Professor, for sharing your insights with us. We were speaking to Professor Markus Wagner from the University of Wollongong, Australia.